Hi everybody, this is Amy-Hubek from Hilliard. I'm here to talk about our readings from DIY Literacy, chapters 3 and 4 this week for cyberpd. This happens to be my third take on this reflection. My goal this time is to not say so much and to hopefully not have any dogs barking or cats invading the camera area. So wish me luck. So let's go ahead and get started with chapter 3. Chapter 3 was all based on memory, the problems that we have in the classroom when it comes to learning being sticky and having seeing whether students are able to master what you've taught them and whether you can see that mastery reflected in their work. So I think this is something we struggle with all the time as teachers, whether it is our expectations for our students or even our own practice. I think it's really difficult to really take the time that is required to really commit something to memory. You know, you hear sometimes that you have to do something at least 7 times for it to become a habit, or things like that, I think really come to mind when we think about how important memory is in the classroom. So I want to start by talking about how at the beginning of the chapter the authors talked about students defaulting to what feels comfortable. So oftentimes we'll work so hard at teaching a point or a strategy, and then we'll come to find that students are just continuing to do what they've always done. However, we can use these teaching tools to help students remember what we've taught them, and we can keep that learning alive, and hopefully not see a plateau of what our expectations are in their work in the classroom. We can use the teaching tools to hold kids accountable and to motivate them. Something that I thought that was really interesting was the fact that they put this quote in their chapter about forgetting information being a vital part of the learning process, an integral way that our brains decide over time new information to hold on to. That makes a lot of sense to me because we've all heard the saying also that if you don't use it, you lose it. And it makes sense to me that the brain would get rid of useless information. So I think, what does that mean for the classroom? I think it means that sometimes we have to remember that students take on a lot of information, sometimes too much information to hold on to at once. And that's why we need to have repeated instruction and repeated exposure to content and strategies so that they can develop that schema in their brain and create long-term memory about what we want them to know about reading and writing. So we need to find a balance. One of my favorite quotes is also from Einstein, never memorize what you can look up in books. So I think we need to really be thoughtful about getting to the meat of what we want students to know and not over-focusing time on information that can be easily recalled with technology or in a book, but rather be more focused on things that aren't so easy to find in a resource or a book, such as the strategies we want kids to do independently when reading and writing. So some telltale signs that memory might be an issue in your classroom is you might see students who look lost, they're asking for clarification all the time, there's stagnation in their work, and they're only using one skill over time. They're really dependent on one learned skill rather than infusing in all the new juicy stuff you're trying to give them. And you might also notice students who are quiet when you conference with them. They just don't know what it is you're looking for them to say. So when you have found that has happened, you can definitely start by setting some goals and narrowing your focus. And to do that, you need to assess independent work. You need to take formative assessment information, assess for learning. And you're going to compare what you see in your student work to prior teaching to see how it matches up. Then you're going to decide which lessons you want to hold the students to, whether it's a reteaching where you need to rechart it, whether you need to bring in some other tools like the bookmarks or the micro-progressions or the demonstration notebook to do some reteaching, or maybe you might even find some good news that, aha, they've learned this, and you can remove those charts if you find that the class has mastered them. So ultimately, we want students to have the experience of automaticity with their learning. Our ultimate goal is for students to not need the tools anymore. So we'll know that they're ready to move on or to get rid of those tools when the timing feels right. We'll see behavioral cues that indicate that they've mastered the skill and no longer need those scaffolds and supports. And you'll notice that there might be a need for an increase in rigor, or you'll find that students are working at a high level of rigor independently with the skills that you've taught them, which is really what we want to do and see and celebrate in the classroom. So speaking of rigor, that brings us to Chapter 4, which is all about what you can do to motivate students to work hard. So one way to help your students work harder is to make sure they know exactly what it means and what it looks like and how to reach for high performance. If we don't teach kids what rigor means or what our expectations are, they're going to continue to do what feels comfortable to them, and they're going to probably continue to plateau and give mediocre work. So I really enjoyed that this chapter reminded me that there are two views of rigor. There's the difficulty of the task, which might be the complexity of the text, the volume of the work, or the standards we're holding the students to. And there's also the other side of the coin, which is the performative description of the behavior. How much work and effort are the students putting into the work in the classroom? And I really like that they pulled in the quote from Kylie Years, "Rigor without relevance is simply hard." That makes a lot of sense to me. If we don't give the students a purpose for their hard work, they're not going to be motivated to do it. I think this is also where growth mindset really plays a big role. We want students to know that the hard work is going to lead to something. And that journey is also what we're on, but it's not just about getting to our destination. It's about what we learn along the way. And I think that's something that can be hard to do as a teacher, is to slow things down and reteach and be really explicit in what we want. But it really pays off, because ultimately we want students to be working independently as often as possible. Control leads to compliance, autonomy leads to engagement. Daniel Pink. So if students are the ones who are being most rigorous in the classroom, they're not just being compliant, but they're being they're highly engaged. And that shows us that there's rigorous work going on in the classroom. And in some situations, we really have to show a clear vision of what rigorous work looks like. So ways that we can do that are all the tools that the authors have talked about in the first half of the book: micro-progressions to map out the path, demonstration notebooks for explicit teaching, charts that are powerful reminders, and bookmarks for personal goal settings for individual students. We can assess whether our class has a need for some rigor instruction by looking at their work. If their work is falling flat in times when they're working totally independently, when you haven't asked explicitly for certain things, that's an indication that the rigor is not there. If you have lots of lightning finishers, or students who are turning in work that is mediocre, telling you they're done or asking you if it's good enough, that's a sign that we need to teach them how to work harder, and that we need to boost their intrinsic motivation. You may also see that there's no arc of growth over time. So we can assess those things by collecting student reflections. We can do some FAR observations by sitting back and watching what they're doing during workshop time. And we can continue to compare their work samples over time using benchmark assessments or even just work samples in their journal. So once we've done that, we can kind of start to think about what do we need to do to get where we want to go. How can we best support rigor in our classroom? Another million-dollar question. So there are 5 ways to cultivate intrinsic motivation in the classroom. That's by providing challenge, curiosity, control, cooperation, and competition, and recognition. So these are all things that we can use during all parts of our days to motivate students to work harder and to engage in more rigorous activity in the classroom. But when I was Googling, I was trying to find an image about intrinsic motivation. I found the same list in an image, but it included fantasy and creativity. So I thought that was interesting that the authors chose to omit fantasy and creativity, because I think that was something that was highly motivated for a lot of my kids in my classroom, was for them to do some creative writing and to use their imagination when responding to text or when writing their own stories. So I think fantasy and creativity is another way that we could support some engagement and rigor in the classroom. So how will we know when they've got it? when you find that students are working overtime. There's nothing better to me than when a student asks if they can just read a little longer, or if they can just work on their writing instead of go on to their next station. I think that's a great clue that we've got them hooked and that they're engaged and they're working hard independently. You can collect student reflections on growth and see what kind of language they're using to see whether they've picked up what you put down. You'll also see students that kind of take on the teacher role, teacher-as-student role. So if you see students who are servicing others in the classroom and coaching them, that's another good sign that that child is working at an appropriate level of rigor and has a positive mindset in the classroom. So I guess my biggest takeaway from the book is that it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey. We want to make sure that we don't get overly focused on that end goal and our checklist or what we're looking for, but rather slow down and make sure that we're doing the maintenance along the road. So if we're going back and reteaching when we see that we need it, if we're modeling the behaviors and reinforcing the behaviors we want to see in the classroom, and we're using all these great ways to cultivate intrinsic motivation in the classroom, we're really going to have a great celebration when we get to our destination at the end of our unit of study or the end of the year. This chapter also inspired me to think about some books I've read that relate to the subject. Never Work Harder Than Your Students is a book by Robin R. Jackson that I think is a really great resource. I've not read it in quite some time, but I did see her speak a few years ago at Hilliard's ILE conference, and she was really inspiring, and I still try to remind myself every day that I should not be the one leaving the school the tiredest. The kids should be just as exhausted as I am. So cheers to continuing to work toward that goal. Another book that I found was this book, Who's Doing the Work? How to Say Less So Readers Can Do More. I want to put this on my to-read list. I've not ordered it yet, but I would love to hear if any of you have read it and what your feedback is on that book, because if you've got good things to say, I'll probably order it and put it in my stack. I hope you have all enjoyed my reflection and I haven't talked your ear off too much. I'll be looking forward to talking to you again next week about chapters 5 and 6 in DIY literacy. Thank you. I'll talk to you later. Bye.